Jackson Pollock. He's probably the person people most often point to when they want to show how modern art is a joke. Even in his own time, his work was controversial and ridiculed. He's also considered by many to be one of America's greatest painters. I'm not here to argue about whether his drip paintings are the work of a genius or the work of a fraud. It's simply undeniable his works are an important part of art history. His art is a significant turning point in a long period of art evolution, or to some, de-evolution. But what is often at best talked about briefly, and at worst outright ignored, is the works outside of his drip period. A period that only lasted for 3 years out of his entire 20-plus years as an artist. Jackson Pollock's early work was surprisingly representational. Some of the first works made after moving to New York in 1930 were Western scenes. These were strongly influenced by the time Pollock had studied under Thomas Hart Benton, who himself used abstract gesture lines before adding any figures. You can also find Jackson Pollock as a model in several of his murals, from which Pollock also likely got his preference for scale. You can see him in this metalworker, or this harmonica player. In these early paintings, you can see liquid landscapes of sentimental Western subjects painted with a looseness and energy that would become very familiar. Even in this very early work, it was clear he was never going to paint something standing still. I think it's worth mentioning around this time, Charles Pollock also studied under Thomas Benton. The eldest brother is said to have persuaded Jackson to come to the East Coast and study art. He also became maybe one of the most overshadowed brothers in history. His work was often very representational, but in time, he would create color-field abstractions, although they were far more orderly than anything Jackson ever produced. Having brothers myself, I wonder if he ever felt resentment. But as far as I can tell, he worked alongside him rather than against him. For what it's worth, there are several of his works I genuinely enjoy. For Jackson Pollock, this early trend of representation would persist, but in time the representation would fall away for abstraction, while the expressive elements would be emphasized. In works like The Flame, representation became a mere impression. In this work, you can only barely make out the skeleton in the foreground, as it's surrounded by violent tongues of red and vigorous brushstrokes. Jackson Pollock would soak up influences like a sponge. In Mask, there is likely influence from Picasso, perhaps more specifically, his famous work, Girl Before a Mirror. In other works, Picasso's influential rhythmic energy is pronounced again and again. In Circle, there's clear imagery from Mesoamerican and Native American art. In Male and Female, one can see hints of dripping around the pillar-like figures and a denser composition. In slightly later works, there are more compressed compositions, with figuration clearly influenced by Mexican muralists such as David Alfaro Siqueiros and Jose Clemente Orozco. Moby Dick is in a very typical abstract expressionist style, with surprisingly flat bordered blocks of color. It's also incredibly visually similar to works by Joan Miró. Probably my favorite of his pre-drip period is Stenographic Figure, with a far more brightly colored and looser composition, providing areas to breathe and figures and symbols to decipher. It's an uncharacteristically zany and airy work. It even received praise from Piet Mondrian, who remarked, "I have the feeling that this may be the most exciting painting I've seen in a long time, here or in Europe." Guardians of the Secret is a surrealist work I find to have an especially pleasing color palette and decorative quality all by itself. It looks like 4 golden deities surround a transparent tomb, holding alien instruments and wearing abstracted golden masks that are barely legible. At the cusp of his drip period, you can almost see these works as meteor versions of his drip paintings. The gestures are there, but the jumbled shapes have not yet been whittled down to their purest form. Even the work that first made him famous, Mural, made for the foyer of Peggy Guggenheim's townhouse, did not feature his signature drips, but clearly the expression of what could be interpreted as a stampede of horses had been emphasized to such an extent that his drip phase was clearly now just over the horizon. It wasn't until 1946 that likely his very first drip painting, Freeform, was produced. This one had a painted-on red background with swirls of black and white flung and dripped onto the canvas. Most of Jackson Pollock's most famous and most analyzed drip paintings were made in the next 3 years, between 1947 to 1950. These are the most scrutinized, the most famous, and most controversial works he ever produced. They all featured what would eventually be called his action painting technique. laying the canvas on the floor and attacking it from all sides. The greatest diversion from traditional painting is that the brush or stick would hover over the canvas, dripping paint from above and never actually touching the surface. Contrary to surface-level impressions, there was a process to his work. A process that, yes, you probably couldn't replicate, at least without some practice. To achieve the viscosity he desired, he would choose industrial and household paints over artist paints. Pollock could control the flow of the paint. He could produce different effects and avoid others. He would add things like sand and broken glass to give it texture. Regardless, they were never meant to be a demonstration of technical skill, but instead, pure expression on canvas. In one exchange, Hans Hofmann commented that he should try working more from nature. Jackson Pollock replied, "I am nature." And even if you don't care about the history, technique, or the supposed expression, I think one can at least appreciate their decorative quality. They often use pleasing, restrained color palettes, evenly weighed compositions, and they are all gargantuan in size, inviting the viewer to dart around and take in the work bit by bit. He eventually halted the output of this exclusively dripping style after one of his most stark and minimal drip works, number 32. His wife, Lee Krasner, said he couldn't have gone further doing the same thing. You can say what you want about him, but he knew when something had run its course. At the peak of his fame, he abruptly ended this style of painting. Soon began his Black Pour period, works made between 1951 to 53 using black enamel paint on unprimed canvas. He used what was considered a different technique, this time more like spilling the paint into the fabric, making soft, fuzzy edges. Then he applied layer after layer, allowing the top layers to keep a more refined edge and glossier finish. These have far denser puddles of color. Although there are noticeable drips here and there is far more blocked-in shapes and tangible directions to the compositions. He eventually returned to representation. In these works, he attempted to explore a middle ground between abstraction and figuration. Even in more abstract paintings, there are partially obscured faces, eyes, ears, hands, and limbs. The rhythm and expression are still there, but in a way honed in, denser, and more detailed. There is a greater clarity and diversity of mark-making. Number 7 is the most anatomically disturbing. This warped portrait seems to exist in many states at once. Marks expanding and shifting around a face you can barely make out. Some works, like these, look as if someone took his drip paintings and bloated the flowing lines. In order to obtain these, he would stack several sheets of absorbent Japanese paper, applying ink to the top sheet and then allowing it to seep through, forming the same but less distinct compositions on each successive sheet. In what is considered his last major work, Portrait and a Dream is maybe the most self-evident in its content, and yet still fascinating. The face is likely a self-portrait of Pollock, and the drip painting besides it is likely a representation of the dream, whatever that might be. I feel this work has an especially meta quality to it. When these works were unveiled at the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York, not a single one of them sold during the show. Being such a departure from his previous work, this was hardly surprising. The works of his last years are more diverse but less numerous, and yet I feel they contain an expressiveness that trumps even some of his most notable drip paintings. Many of them are more personal in content, more agonized over. Throughout his last years, Pollock would experience a relentless period of artist block, alcoholism, and decline, producing fewer and fewer works. During this decline, it apparently got so bad, his neighbors once removed the distributor cap from his car's engine in order to prevent him from driving drunk. All of this culminated in his drunken automobile death, which at this point seems almost as infamous as his paintings. Pollock's sleeping effort may be the greatest later divergence from his drip paintings, as it is quite similar to an earlier work in color and style, with a bluish sky interacting with heaps of browns and orange. In Easter and the Totem, there is a return to using a brush traditionally. There was a return to Matissean brighter colors and quasi-figurative images. It seems like an overall reevaluation and combination with an earlier, more influenced Pollock. White Light is the only painting Pollock completed in 1954. Evidence from the tendrils of paint in the top layers show he made the work by squeezing paint directly from a tube onto the canvas. The work is incredibly dense, essentially creating a weave of marble white and black, with the subtlest hints of color buried beneath it. Then we have The Deep, the painting that inspired this whole video. Oh man, I really like this painting. Nearly everything on its surface is a departure from what we've seen, but underneath, there is still a skeletal structure that is uniquely Pollock. It's stark but not colorless. Sprinkled throughout are mere moments of blue and yellow. This gash of black in the earth is painted over by white foliage. Just the most restrained number of drips lie between the edges like sinew. Fleshy bits of white cross over the chasm, resisting getting sucked in, migrating over in a delicate dance for survival. All I can think of is a void slowly collapsing in on itself. In 1955, he created his last two paintings, Scent and Search. These are especially violent in technique and content. They are grimy expressions of pain, rendered in overwhelming attacks of black and red. Only one word is spoken by these works: rage. The context behind these creations, that being the dark tail end of Jackson's life, is a revealing one. These works are personal explorations of the psyche of a very troubled man with a chronic addiction. Unfortunately, it really seems like there could have been more, like these explorations were cut short. Or maybe, like many of the abstract expressionists, the candle that burned twice as bright burned half as long. Throughout Jackson Pollock's short life, his art developed several times. It's a shame we would never see how, or if, his style of work would ever evolve again. It wasn't until 1946 that likely his very first drip painting,